Hello everyone, and welcome to the first chapter of our Intro to the Environment Effects course. This course has been carefully made based on years of knowledge and experience in the games industry. Our goal is to give you a comprehensive hands-on understanding of the techniques and workflows professionals use every day. If you like what we've done here and you want to learn more about creating realistic effects, check out the full course, the link is in the description. Hope you guys enjoy this, and we'll see you in the next one. Hello everybody, and welcome to the first lesson of this course. In this lesson, I wanted to go over the importance of visual effects in environments and how they have such a big impact on a scene and what does it do to change your mood and make things more interesting. So for instance, we have this screenshot of the Paragon scene that we have in Unreal, and I've taken the liberty of taking all the effects out of this scene and then making a new set of effects and try to change the mood of this screenshot. Here you'll see that I set up a more of a moody and a dark tone scene. So for something like this, when you're trying to get a little bit of understanding of how things work, first off, I added a little bit of mist, I added a little bit of fog and so on to first get the depth of the scene and try and convey a sense of coldness and a sense of this is dangerous, you shouldn't be here, and coldness. So that's what I'm trying to do here. So I've taken the liberty of making some examples here of some of the effects that are used in games and how they change the entire scenery. So for example, we have like from Red Dead Redemption, you'll see here that these effects are basically given life to the world. For example, we have our chimney to show that there's life, like this is an industrial scene where things are happening. You have the birds in the scene. So even though this is more of an animation thing when it comes to birds, it's a bit of a misconception, but VFX artists are actually the guys that do the birds and the living world that you see in most of the games. And mostly it's vertex animated, and so you'll basically see it a lot in games. So here we have, again, same, we have the birds or butterflies and things like that in the scene. And you can see here, we have a little bit of depth in here. And partly that you can see that depth is because of the gradation of the fog here. So it gives it that bit of, oh, that is really far away to the point that you can't actually see what's going on. Here we have Ghost of Tsushima, where you can see that how the environment is being affected by the mist, the fog, and everything around it. And this is one of my favorite scenes from the game. You can see how intense the atmosphere is because of the fire, the wind, and how the actual leaves and the embers and the smoke that's happening in the scene. So, and you can also just a little bit, like if, for example, if I pause this, you'll see that in the background, there is a bit of fog. We can actually see this because of the compression for this. So at least that's a GIF. But yeah, you can see what I'm talking about here. Mostly like some of the stuff that you will see in like the living world that you'll see around you. It's more of how can I make this alive? How can I give it that sense of this is not static, this is more alive, and you can actually see that it's something that when you see, you can tell that there's nothing wrong with it, but at the same time, if you don't have these subtle things in the world, you can see that, oh, something is missing. So for example, like I do have a lot of references of fog, but fog is what gives you that depth, and mist and so on. And also the same thing with falling leaves and so on. So for example, here, part of the reason I like this is like even the camera that is zooming in, you can actually see that it is a windy scene because you can actually see the snow kick-ups. You can see to the side here that there's a little bit of snow falling. And also, again, the depth of the smoke and the fog. Again, same thing with these two scenes. For this one is a little bit different because it's more of you're actually seeing the water vapor and everything that's happening in the world. So for example, if we actually remove the water vapor, you'll see that it's a little bit of a static thing where just water hits the ground. Water hits the waterfall hits the water at the bottom, but nothing usually happens and so on. It just feels like something is missing. So adding those supporting elements like vapor, a little bit of mist, and like, for example, you'll see here at this side, you'll see a lot of like the mist in the air, and you'll see a little bit of birds and things like that. That's what gives this world its life. It's the living particles that you see in the world. Same thing here. For example, if you see like the background where you have birds, you have the rays, you have the fog, the ocean, it's everything coming together to give you that big sense of scale. And that's what you're looking for when you're trying to do environment effects. I'm just going to turn on all of these to show what I mean. So again, Elden Ring, great use of fog and particles to convey sense of scale and depth. Again, same here. Also, in like for example, in Control, you have this scene where it looks creepy, cold, and a bit of darkness in there, and that's why the sense of that's what the scene is trying to convey to the player. And for example, like in Uncharted here, you'll see that this is like more of weather, rain. You have a little bit of smoke, and everything is intense, dark. That's also the sense of like, for example, the weather and the wetness, the coldness. That's what the effects artists are trying to convey, and that's what something that you should understand when you're trying to make an effect is every effect has its purpose. For example, if you're making a campfire, and you're trying to put it in a scene, but things don't look right, most of the time, it's basically the fire is either meant for something else and not for a campfire, or the way that it's made, it has a different purpose. So yeah, and over here you'll see that you have the fallen leaves, a little bit of fireflies in the air, and so on. That's what, for example, that's what environment effects are. It's just trying to bring a world to life, give it depth, give it scale, give it a sense of moodiness, a sense of happiness, and so on. But yeah, I hope you enjoyed this lesson, just explaining what the differences are and what's the uses. If you have any questions, please let us know and give us feedback on the courses or the course in the Discord. Thank you so much. I'm looking forward for you to take the next step in your journey as a VFX artist. Hello, everybody, and welcome to our second lesson, Gathering Reference. So one thing I didn't realize when I first started in this industry was how important it is to actually gather good reference. And it was always hard for me because I always thought that I can just do it with something that comes up in my head, right? But the biggest issue there is I didn't know how to get different elements. For example, one thing like this hologram here, like I did this for my hologram tutorial on YouTube, but later on I realized, like after talking to a lot of people, part of the reason they gather reference is to get elements from them. And actually getting good elements and understanding how things work and breaking things down, that's the importance. That's why it's important to get good reference. So for example, when I was doing that tutorial, I pointed out like, okay, for example, I like these dots. I wanted to add them in my hologram. I wanted to get it to a good point. So I'm like, okay, I can make a texture that has dotted lines, and I can just blend that with my holograms, and it's going to make it look good. The other element that I wanted to add in there, for example, was these scan lines. So when you have a hologram that has like these wobbly lines and glitching and everything, and that's what I wanted to add in there. And that's how, when you gather enough reference, you'll start to see different elements, and that's how you can actually get that into your effect. So for example, I don't do much of stylized or hand-drawn or things like that. My main specialty is realistic. So I gather a lot of realistic references. So these are most of these are just screenshots, but I would always say go for the videos, because then you can see what's going on. You can understand motion. You can understand the color, how things change, and so on. But for this demonstration, I pulled up the list of stuff that I had made a long time ago with just screenshots, because I like these frames. I liked for example, the colors. I liked the smoke, the intensity, and so on. So, for example, for explosions, I always know if I wanted to have a bright explosion and a different type of explosion, it would be gasoline. If I wanted to have a gas explosion, it would be quick, and so on and so on and so on. So, for example, if I wanted to make an explosion for a car, it will have this initial frame, or the initial blast, and that's where I drive my simulations off of. And then the after effects would be the fire, the smoke, and everything else around it. So, and this is how you get the different elements, for example, for explosions. Or let's say, for example, you like this explosion better, the one we have here, but you also liked the way that the explosion that drove this car to be in this type of position, and the force and so on, is different. So you try and take smaller elements from each one of these and basically add them to your effect and make sure that they look good. So big example here, we have the smoke, we have the fire and the intensity, and so on. So that's why, like in these shots, I say go for the videos and not shots, because you're only seeing one frame here. But so let's say for something like this, for example, when I look at the smoke, I can tell that this is burning either rubber or burning something that is flammable, and it causes a lot of it gives a lot of smoke. So for example, this is not a gas explosion. That's for sure, because gas explosions don't have the fuel and the pressure to burn that type, to cause that type of smoke. So yeah. So for example, when I'm doing my explosions, I try to take elements, and when I make my simulations, I'll see everything together then. And for example, same thing with water. If you're trying to do an explosion for water or splashes or things like that, always go for videos, but this is just an example of elements that I would take, for example, from this shot. The way I see it here, I can use this for water. I can use this for sand, dirt. So the way I see it is, let's say you have your the center, which is the point of the force pushing things outward. And in my mind, I'm like, okay, what can I do to actually replicate this in my scene? And how can I take these elements and make them more into a game element? So let's say, for example, I would take something like this and recreate it in a simulation. And then I would try to use that in a generic way to give the same type of effect. Same thing here for different impacts, explosions, missiles, and so on. I always try to take a lot of references to try and find good elements that I can take from here. So for example, here, I really like sand explosions a lot. And so for this type of explosion, like you cannot recreate this thing in a game with just one simulation. It's multiple different elements. So you'd have your dirt, rocks, you would have your smoke, you have the spiky smokes coming out of there because of the impact of the force. You have the fire here a little bit in the background, and so on. Same thing here. For example, you look at this and you're like, okay, I like the fire. I don't like the smoke. So what can I do to get the same type of fire or the same type of explosion, but not this type of smoke, and so on and so on. So it's not just for realistic for me. I also enjoyed gathering reference for hand-drawn, stylized, just to get familiar with the different styles and try and see like what elements I can use to make things even better and so on. Granted, I haven't really used stylization in my own work, but it's just good practice for me to do. Just gather a lot of reference to see how things work in different styles. But yeah, I hope you enjoyed this lecture, and I hope to see you in the next one.
When it comes to environmental effects, even the smallest effects you're working on can have a very big impact on the scene. In the first lecture, we're gonna go over how to create some dust motes, which are a great way to fill the scene and make everything seem a bit more alive. This will be a good start for some of the less experienced students, because we will go over how to create the basic principles in Photoshop, Substance Designer, as well as Niagara. But even for the more experienced people, we will have a couple more interesting techniques which they can apply. Starting with the texture creation, we will build the same texture in Substance Designer and Photoshop, so you can kind of learn the basics of those two programs and simply decide which one you prefer or have access to. Afterwards, we will jump into Unreal and build our first particle system, which afterwards we will change up a bit to kind of make it a bit more performant, and also teach you a couple more advanced techniques along the way, which can be very handy to use in production. So let's start with our first lesson and make you an environmental VFX wizard. In this lecture, we're gonna go over the basics on how to create like a motes splatter texture. And what you can see in here already is like a tileable splatter texture for it. So this is gonna be the first thing which we're gonna create. From there on, we will jump into a smaller one, which is done for like the individual sprites. This one will basically build upon this one, where we take this just a tiny bit and then basically mask out the edges. And then in the end, we just go in, scale it smaller, adjust a couple more things, create it more of like a focus point in the middle, and just scale it very small for the actual like individual small particles. Because like you can see here, like it's 64 times 64, and you can even go lower with stuff like this, so there doesn't need to be a lot of detail. But let me actually show you how we're gonna approach that. So if we jump into Photoshop, this right here is like a 1K texture, so 1024 times 1024, and we could go in and just like basically draw a bunch of like smaller points like this, obviously a bit more beautiful, and then just like duplicate that, blur it, and do a couple of things. But when it comes to stuff like this, it's actually quite useful to just go with stuff which is actually already available, because there's a bunch of time you actually don't have the time for doing stuff like this. So there is a bunch of very nice Photoshop brushes online for free, which you can download. And for this one, we're going to go with This Here by the lovely Nathan Brown. You can just download it and use it. And as soon as you did that, you basically go in here and then you can just download another thing and use it in here. So you click on the three little lines and go to import brushes. I already downloaded it in here, so when we go into the environment courses, just the ABR file, that's what's going to be used, and then we get it. So there it is. Those are the brushes. There's like multiple ones in here, and the first thing which we're going to do is we create a second layer, because we should definitely work with layers on those. And what you can already see, if I scale it bigger, this is kind of what it looks like. So yeah, basically it's just a square with a lot of dots, different distribution when it comes to a couple of things. There's also multiple ones which already have like scaling and stuff applied, so this is always very big by default. So go with something which actually fits the size of our canvas. So this here, it's actually not too bad, but a bit too big. So we're gonna go with like 400, and then what we can do in here is we go to the brush settings, and then we have smoothing already enabled. It doesn't really help us a lot on here because we're not gonna paint like this. For it, we will go into the scattering part, and we're gonna make like a count jitter, different values here to kind of stretch it a bit, and here shape dynamics, the size, as well as like the angle. That is the most important one for it. And yeah, basically from there on, we're just gonna kind of paint a couple of spots in here. If you take a look at this, this is actually a bit too noisy, so we're gonna do a bigger version. So let's go with something like 700. So when doing this now, you don't really need to care a lot about like distribution or stuff, because we're gonna like adjust that anyway afterwards. Because what we have right now, this looks like something, but it's not really gonna be a nice final result. So what we're gonna do is we take like a second layer and we select a different brush for it. So this one, that's a bit too directional, so this one, this is kind of nice. And we just add a couple smaller things here in the background, and those would be just smaller, not really smaller, less opacity. So you can also put it in the background, and just kind of keep in mind, this is supposed to be like the background, which you can then adjust nicely to create a bit more contrast in the image, which can be really useful just to give a bit of depth to textures which usually don't really have them. And yeah, so from here on, this is a decent start. Obviously spend a bit more time on it to really make it sell. And then there's the most important part, because we want to use this in a titleable fashion, which means those pixels here on the bottom and those on the top, they should be the same. So when you tile it and you move it upwards, it always shows it. And I can kind of super easily show you what I mean with that. If we now merge those layers here together, we can go to filter, go to other, and then the offset. And the offset, let me get that up here. That is pretty much the same thing which we're gonna have like in Unreal. So whenever you're gonna use a tiling texture and you kind of move it around, or like a panner node, that's what it's doing. It just kind of moves the UVs. And with a lot of textures, you usually get into the issue that it's not nicely tileable. Especially Photoshop comes with a bunch of little issues. As soon as you blur something, there will be like a little line in here. And in here, honestly, it's not as noticeable because it's a very noisy texture in general. But if we kind of go a bit closer, then you're gonna notice there is a line. You see that? So now let me select a bit of a better brush for that. So here you have a line. Basically, there's a cross in this image, and you don't want to get that. So for a texture like this, getting rid of it is likely quite easy. There's multiple ways of doing it. You could right now just literally draw stuff over. A pretty well-known or like well-used method is just to take like here the smudge tool and just be like whoop, whoop, whoop. Not on this scale, so it would go a bit closer in. Put the size smaller. Hardness should be 0 for stuff like this. And then also you have here strength 100, which is way too much. You go with like 15, let's say that. And then you could kind of move those in here and out and just create a bit of a pattern which flows into each other. This is not great yet, but what we're going to use, because that's honestly quite easy on such an image, we're just going to use the clone stamp tool. So when we go to there it is, the spot healing brush tool. So we can draw something like this here, and it's not gonna do what I want. Okay. The healing brush tool. I'm sorry, it was the wrong one. Yes, and then with Alt and plus we can kind of adjust those things, and we can redraw the shape we just selected. So if you see here, when we use like Alt, we can basically say, okay, this is the area, can kind of mark it, and then just with the left mouse button, you can redraw it. So there you have like these spots we just selected, and you kind of can draw those in, sample a couple of them, each couple of units, and then this is gonna look a lot more natural if you do it nicely. So same with here, just draw a couple of those in, and that's probably gonna be it for this image. Like I said, for this one, it's not too hard because it's a very noisy image. There won't be like a lot of really strong cuts, and even if there are, it's not gonna be that visible. Yeah, if we have those now, something which you can do to enhance it even further, we already added like 2 layers. Create another one, and then what we're gonna do with it is we're gonna offset it. So we're gonna kind of move it. Something like this would be nice. So just to get a bit more detail in there, and then put it to either lighten or add. Screen can also look quite nice for some parts. Multiply can give you nice contrast, but it's gonna erase a lot of detail obviously from the image. So depending on what you want right now, it might not really be what you need. So let's go with screen, and then adjust it a bit again, and yeah, just give it a bit more detail. Other things which you can do is you go in here, you select the levels, and therefore just kind of mask out certain parts of the image, either make them brighter or make them just very, very visible. This is too much for us, but like we can go with something like this here. So when you have stuff like this, it always kind of is important to check it afterwards in the engine. So when we take this as a reference and we would now kind of use it in the engine, what you can see here is those things, the final result which I had, are really soft. First of all, I used a slightly different brush. And then also what I did is I erased stuff afterwards. So when I have like all of this, I go in here and basically merge those layers together. And from there on, just start masking a couple of things out. For that one, you can go with like a pretty low hardness value, just a default brush. And also lower the opacity. You don't want to like erase everything like immediately, super strongly. But now you kind of go in here and you can just draw in a couple of nice shapes and make it a bit easier for yourself, and don't try to draw immediately over the edge, because if you do that, there's a decent chance that you would need to go back into actually adjusting everything because the tiling might break. Like I said, for this kind of texture, not too bad. But yeah, just keep it in mind. So if we have all of this here, this already looks a bit nicer. And then the opacity can be a bit lower, something like this. We don't need that much detail in it. And as a last step, you could go in and slightly blur it. This is way too much. Go in and go to something like this here. 3 pixels. That could be nice. Keep it at whole values. Therefore, it breaks less often when you try to tile it. See, so there is a little thing here. So let me quickly adjust that so that you also see the entire process again. So we go in here. You see the edge, and yeah, this time we're going to do something slightly different. We're going to go in here and we're going to abuse the fill tool. So this is too much. Select something, so you can just use L for the lasso tool, and a right mouse button, and you can say content aware fill. And basically, if you apparently there's not enough source material for this one, but usually what you can do is you just kind of do this and then fill content aware stuff, and it would fill it out, which can be really nice when you start blurring it a bit more like we did in here. This sometimes does not get enough information. So then we just kind of go in here with the approach I told you. So we just move all the stuff slightly. Now it's blurred, so it is even easier to see. Just kind of move it into multiple directions to kind of smudge it a bit together. And this will already kind of do the trick for it. You really don't need to spend a lot more time on it, but make sure that there's like no edges visible anymore, because they can still appear in your effects, and that can be really annoying to just look at. So if we have this, we're pretty much good to go. So last check, going into filter, going into other offset, and just kind of move it around, see if you still spot certain pixels where there's like a black line for the edge. If not, and you're happy with it, just use that, import it to the engine, and then continue from there on. We're actually going to do the next one immediately out of this one because it just makes sense. Like I said, this one is for the tileable stuff, which we're going to use later, and the next one is going to be for the individual sprites. So sometimes you just want to spawn stuff on a sprite, and then you don't want to have like the edges show up. This one is super easy. We just created basically the perfect base for it. You duplicate it, you're gonna move it here with an offset again. That's the wrong offset. Here. And just try to find a spot where it's like nicely distributed and it just looks kind of interesting. This one. Maybe like this. This is good. Yeah, you go in there and then it's really easy. Just erase the edges, right? So this time you can put the opacity quite high and then just slowly go to the edges, click a couple of times, erase them, and try to make sure that you don't get like a boxy feeling to it. So it should kind of feel natural. Also don't do this. So I already erased a bit too much. So what you can do, you do the first rough edge cleanup, and then you go in and change the opacity a bit lower, and then just kind of create more soft fall-offs on those things. And this is probably actually going to work out like this. So yeah. So this is what we're going to have right now. We can do the same stuff as before, where we therefore just kind of say, okay, this is the base, use the second layer, duplicate it again, rotate it or edit however you want to use it. So one useful thing can be to just kind of go in here and with Control T, you can go into transform mode and then just say flip vertical and also flip horizontal, those two things. You can do scale it a bit, and then you can kind of break up the silhouette a bit more again and just get a bit more of a natural looking feel to it. So yeah, when we have this, similar as before, we can adjust here some of the opacity values, and yeah, basically this is gonna be our sprite in the end. Try to create something which does have like a nice shape to it. So you can go in here and take a look. This is how the end result was. So again, slightly different brush, more points, therefore smaller, which I can recommend for stuff like this, but you always need to kind of find what works for you, because having bigger points like this here can be really useful, so it won't be erased by certain post-process effects like anti-aliasing and those kind of fun little things which always get into your way, and then suddenly you lose all the information. But if you have those bigger, brighter points, they might still be visible, and therefore you actually get more out of your texture. And then, yeah, last thing, pretty similar. You would just take this again. I would duplicate those two layers, because this time we actually want something which has like a lot of like detail in the middle. We go in here, put it in the middle, put it like to 100%, and then we can just kind of even add like multiple more brush strokes onto it, because at this point what we want is, we don't really care a lot more about like the shape and everything. We just care about like something which is actually visible, right? So if we go back to our brushes, and we select our brush particles, let's find something which is actually quite dense, which this one isn't. Also not the first one. Yeah, that's good. So yeah, do a layer on top and just draw a bunch of those in, something like this. Can be really messy, honestly, because we immediately gonna erase most of the stuff again here in the middle. We just want to have like a dedicated spot in the middle, which is brighter. We're also gonna like blur this immediately, because like you've seen in the final image, this here is more of a very small texture, which you always need to kind of make sure. So use, by the way, it's a Control minus and Control plus in Photoshop if you're not used to it, where you can zoom in and out. And therefore you need to be able to see something if you're on this kind of scale. So you can actually adjust a lot of those layers which are down here to just kind of make sure that you can still get something. This doesn't need to really look or feel like dust. It just kind of needs to have an interesting shape with some like little dots and details in there, which kind of indicate that there's like more to it, which usually motes are when they break light. So yeah, that's basically it on how to do all those 3 different things in Photoshop, and we're gonna jump to Designer right away to kind of see how to approach it in there. When now being in Designer, everything kind of changes on how we approach stuff. I'm gonna go over a couple basic things in Designer, but overall it's gonna be quite much more a thing of like, how do we get those results in? So for people who are already used to Designer, there's not gonna be like much more to it. For people who've never opened it, that's Designer. a node-based texture creation program which got quite popular over the last couple of years. And it comes with a bunch of nice pre-made nodes, which make just our life a bit easier when we try to create that. So we want to recreate the same stuff we now did in Photoshop. And the easiest way for us is with using pre-made noise nodes. One of them is the clouds nodes, which is quite often used in a lot of cases. And we're also going to use those in a bunch of other modules. And from there on, this is a noise generator, which has like two adjustable parameters. First of all is the scale, and this is literally like the tiling. You can kind of think of it like that. And then the disorder, which just changes a couple of noise parameters, and therefore you can read just different results. And this one we want to use for actually masking out something. And what do we want to mask out? In Designer, there's like a really good dirt mask. And if you see this, you can already see what I'm trying to get out of this, right? This is super close what we want. This is basically what we already created in Photoshop, and we're just gonna recreate it now here in Designer, but in a bit of a different manner. So we have the Dirt 2, and there's also the Dirt 1, which is quite similar, but just a lot more stuff, right? So it's just, this one has only a couple of dots, and this overall just gives you a way better, it gives you a fuller image, right? So when we have all three of those, we want to somehow blend them together. And like, by the way, if you press middle mouse button, you're going to open up the window for the nodes, and then you can just search for something. So this is the blend node, which in Photoshop would be layer masks or layer blend modes, depending on kind of how you want to see it. So we want to somehow mix those two up. Here we have the Dirt 2 and the Dirt 1. And if I just plug it in, the first one is going to be the foreground. The second one is the background. The foreground one is the one which you're going to adjust here with the opacity. So that is the layer which is on top in Photoshop. And if you therefore adjust the opacity, you adjust the opacity of this thing. If you do it like this, you can already see like we adjust this opacity and therefore blend in like the Dirt 1, which is on the lower layer or the background in Designer. But we can also use a mask for driving this. So if we put it back one to one, we just get the upper layer, so Dirt 2. If we then plug the Clouds 2 node into the opacity, we will immediately kind of fill it based on, what kind of value we have. Like if it's white, then we get like the Dirt 2, so the upper layer. If it's black, then we get Dirt 1, so the lower layer. And we kind of want to use it like this because like this one does have like a lot of white values in it. And so if you can see this, and we don't want to have like that much noise in it, right? So like the Dirt 1, there's so much going on, and it's really nice for filling in certain spots, but we don't want to just have a completely cluttered, noisy texture. So we want to have like the Dirt 2 for most places, therefore having this texture to just kind of blend in the Dirt 2 on all the white spots, and the black spots will have like small holes where Dirt 1, so a bit more noisiness, will be filled in. And then if we blend those together, this is the result we're getting. So basically this would be a really good start. And this already gives us a tileable texture because one thing which comes in Designer kind of by default, except you change a couple of things, is it is perfectly tileable. See? So I can use a transform node and then I can kind of move it. That's similar to the offset in Photoshop. And you can see there it just looks perfectly tiled. And if you press spacebar, you can also just tile it and see it, how it would look like. So this means we basically immediately have like our desired result. And from here, we could change the disorder, the scaling, and just a couple of other little factors in here to just create something which we think looks good and is not too noisy. From there on, what we could use is like a blur HQ grayscale, put the quality to 1, and then the intensity, just do something quite subtle. So maybe 1, that can look nice. And there you can see we basically immediately have what we have like in Unreal right now already with the final texture. And yeah, how would we go about like doing the other two? The one which is not tileable, we just go into transform and just kind of move it a bit around, you know, like we did before. Just get a nice spot like this. Yeah. And then we just want to get a shape. How you write shape, that's how you write shape. And we go into, paraboloid, so basically circular fall off, and then we blend those. So what we want to do is we use the shape we generated as a mask. So we could have also put it into opacity, but the way you usually do it, you take those two and you would change it to multiply, and therefore you now have like something which is masked out around the edges. And this looks already decent, I would say, but we want to have something which does not look that ball shaped, right? So we might get quite close to the camera or to the sprite in this example, and therefore it just looks kind of weird, like this almost planet shaped thing. So let's go in here. Let's use a warp, and what a warp does, it just kind of, whatever you put in here, it's going to distort this shape based on this. So if we take, let's use another clouds because we already know it at this point, right? So just put it in here, and this is the result we have. So this won't really work nicely. So we need to first scale it a bit smaller, and then in here we can go in and like just adjust it. So this might be a bit weird to look at. So we might use something different. So this has a bit too much detail. So if we go in here and say we use a Perlin noise, and a Perlin noise can get quite small without having any issue. So let's use this. And now we have this here. And this looks a lot more natural to it. And then if we also blur this a bit more, then we're going to have like a result which you can use quite nicely in here as the final blend. And if you now start playing around here a bit with the Perlin noise, just adjust the scaling. And actually this is kind of good. You will have something which looks way less like a ball and a bit more natural. So yeah, that is how to create the single sprite texture. And the last one is gonna be pretty similar again. So we would take those things, and since it would be smaller, and there's also a little tip for you guys in here. So if we take a levels node, for example, so we have this, and you can always see like the texture resolution on the bottom. Right now we use 1K. In the final game version we would use 512 because that's more than enough. But we know that this one is going to be quite small. So we want to see what it would actually look like. In Photoshop for that we zoomed out, which you can do here as well. But there's actually a better way. So you can go in here and just like adjust here. If you click on the node, double click it, you have the output size, and that will basically tell it how big is the final texture. And this here, the input is a 2 times step down from the parent texture. So if we say -4, then it's 1/16 of that texture, which translates to 64. And therefore we also only see the actual texture which we're going to get out of here. And we want to adjust a couple of things here. So when you go in here and we take the levels, literal same behavior as like in Photoshop, but we want to make sure that just like it pops a bit more. And therefore we want to kind of strengthen it a bit. This could work. Try to keep still a bit of a gradient in there just to kind of make it an interesting visual to look at, even though it's tiny, right? But like it still interacts nicely if it does have like a tiny detail, and therefore we use the right side here, which is a bit brighter, and then kind of something which is almost in shadow, you could say. Yeah, and that's actually it. We have the first texture, which is tileable. We do have a second texture, which is the single one, and then we have the actual single tiny one, which is the individual motes in the air, all done in this small little gradient. Therefore, you can see Designer can be a really nice tool. It is not really better in any way than Photoshop. It can be a big help for some things, but overall, you just kind of need to say what you personally either have access to, because that's what it comes down a lot of time to, or just what you prefer. It's different systems. One is a bit more, I wouldn't say artsy, but just overall a more traditional way of approaching texture drawing. And this one here is a bit more programmery for a lot of people. But both things can be super useful to learn and just play around with it, see what you like more. You can, like you see, get basically the same result out of both. It just depends on how well you know the program and how much time you spend into it. And yeah, from there on, we're gonna take the individual textures, this one, which we're gonna save, and we're gonna go here into our starting folder, environment textures, and we're gonna export it as a PNG, which is somewhere. There. Oh, sorry, I was blind. And we're gonna call it fx underscore dust modes. And now you can either go with something which like tells you quite easily what it is. So we could say tileable, or you go with something like 01, 02, 03, which I usually do, but that will depend a lot on your texture convention naming in either company. But I prefer, for doing it by yourself, to just call it something which you will recognize. So tileable, then we go in here, do the same. Rename it from tileable to single, or cluster is actually a better name for it. And then we're going to call the last one the single. Yeah, that's it. That's the first textures we're going to create for the course. And now let's see how we're actually going to use that in the class. And now we're in Unreal, and we're actually going to do the particle system, but before that we will go over the material creation, because whenever you do a particle, you need a shader which is kind of showing off the texture you just created. So we created this modes folder in here, and we're gonna do a second one in here, which we're gonna call materials. And if you go in here, we right mouse button, material, and then we're gonna call it empty underscore modes 01. And this will now be our material. By default, there's a couple of settings here, and those kind of correlate to the default way of creating materials in a modern game engine, which is the PBR workflow. We won't go into a lot of detail over this because it doesn't really make a lot of sense for us right now. So the important part for us here is that we will need to get just a couple of different things in. So we don't need all of those things here, but what we need is we need a way of making the mesh or the sprite we're now going to use semi-transparent. So we're going to go into the blend mode, and we change it from opaque to translucent. And there you go. Now we have something which we can control the opacity with. So if I press like 1, this is going to place down a value. So like 1 and left mouse button. It's always going to give you a float. Plug it into opacity. And if it's 0, it's not going to be visible. Put that up to like 0.3. See it a bit. 4 more. And you get the idea. At 1, it's fully visible. And we also have the emissive color as well as the base color. For our current use case, we won't use the emissive color because usually dust motes don't really produce light on their own. There are ways to use this to actually fake stuff, but this won't really be our use case for it. So, as the first one, we want to be able to get an actual color in here. And the easiest way for this is to use the particle color module. So right mouse button and you can just type it down in here. And the particle color module will give us whatever color we select in the particle system in here as an RGB value. So red, green, and blue. And we can plug this into the base color. And the default value in here is white. So suddenly it turns white. And if we would select now blue in the particle system, we get a blue base color. This will still kind of be affected by shadows, which the emissive color would not. So just to kind of keep that in mind, and we get the RGB pin in here, so the color, and we have the A, so the opacity in here. So what we want to use is we kind of plug that into the opacity, and now we can control the color as well as the opacity in our particle system. But that's obviously not really enough to what we try to achieve right now. So if we go in here, we want to get a texture. So T, left mouse button, is going to give you a texture sample. And we're going to create like multiple ones of those. So I'm quickly going to show you how we can achieve that. So if we have a texture sample node, or any node, honestly, you press right mouse button on it, you can say convert to parameter. And then it's going to change it. And then you give it a name, like let's call it TX mask for this one. And what this is going to do is it basically changes the node to something which we can exchange later on. So right now, what we want to use is a texture. So we go in here and then we just look for the textures we just created. And in this example, we're going to go with like the basic one. So you can just kind of grab it here, splatter, and just move it in here, drag and drop. And yeah, from here on, we will play around with a few little things. And the base of it is going to be that we want this mask to multiply with the opacity. So we can press M and then left mouse button. And we're going to use the green channel here. You cannot use any channel, but keep in mind the green channel is usually the most precise of like all those channels. The alpha can also be quite precise, but like green, whenever you have like all of those channels available, it's a really good choice. And then we just kind of multiply it with the alpha in here and then plug that into the opacity. And suddenly we have something which we barely can see. And that is because our values here are quite low. Take a look. So pretty soft. And we kind of want to try to see what we can do with it. So if we have this, then the next part is going to be just being able to change the opacity a bit more. So we have already this in here, but it can be nice for us to just kind of visualize what we're doing a bit more. So go in here, and if you press then like S and left mouse button, you're going to get the float. Same as before with 1, but like it immediately is going to convert it to a parameter, which we can control. So this here, S is going to be the same as like pressing 1, and then saying right mouse button, convert to a parameter. Same thing, just faster. So we want to put that to, let's say, 50 right now, because we want to actually see it, right? And there you go. Suddenly we can see it in here. This is our texture. And yeah, from here on, we will kind of build just one more functionality in it, which I'm quickly going to explain. And it is not that hard to use, but I want you to kind of understand the idea behind it. So what we're going to use is a depth fade. And a depth fade is something which fades something based on a distance. So when we go in here and we use the depth fade on the base color, let me just do that here. We're going to ignore all of that. This is our plane right now, right? So let's use it. We go in here, we select the material, and then if we go into the scene, let's just place here, let's say a sphere. Sphere is nice. So now that we have this, we want to apply the material, which is done like this. And you can immediately see that it changed colors. And this is because of the depth fade. So if you put the fade distance to 0, it's going to look normal. But if we change the fade distance in here to something like 200, this is going to kind of create a black gradient on it. How this works is there's something called a depth buffer in Unreal, which I'm not going to go into a lot of detail right now, but basically what it does is it takes this image we see right now and it creates a grayscale image, which just shows how far are those pixels away from the camera. So if we would have like something like this, those are not really far away, right? So like it would be, I don't know, 0.2 meters or something like that. And then completely back there, it's like 200 meters or something like that. And what we do with this is with the depth fade, we just kind of compare, okay, this position in the pixel, how close is that to the position which is next to it, so behind it. And what this will create is you can kind of say, okay, I want every single value on this transparent object, it needs to be transparent, to be colored based on how close it is to a surface. So when we put it like this, it gets quite close, right? So there you can actually see the depth buffer, which is always a kind of cool little thing to showcase. This is what the depth buffer looks like. But just, kind of keep that in mind. But the value we are choosing in the fade distance, that is what the value is which we want to put a gradient towards. So if we put that to 20, which is going to be very small here on the bottom. But what we get if we also put that into the opacity is a mesh which is fading in. So let's put it to 50. And now we have a sphere which does not create a really harsh cut on the ground, but it actually kind of slowly fades in, and therefore even if I show it like this, it doesn't look like it cuts through the ground. And this is what we want, because whenever we have like a nice sprite or something and it kind of clips through the edge and then you see this ugly edge, this is just not great. So this is what we're going to use now. And we're going to go back to this version, and this is how you use it. Whatever opacity you have already, you can feed it in here and then change the fade distance in here. And we're going to use another parameter again for this. We're going to call it fade distance. And by default, we're going to put it to something quite low, like 25. It's usually enough. And this is going to be the start of our material. We still want to have like one more functionality, and this is what I'm going to show you now as well. So I actually got rid of this here, so let me get it back in here. This is what we have. So quickly deactivate both things, honestly. We can use that. So we have right now a sphere which would fade in from the bottom, but we can get very close to this, right? So, and we can kind of clip through it. And this is not really great for dust motes or anything which is kind of low resolution and just like quite, grainier in general. So if I put this back in, you will immediately see what I mean, because like here, we don't want to be able to get that close because that looks not great. Those textures are made for being seen at like this scale or something like this, but you shouldn't be able to get too close. And therefore we're going to use like a second function, which I'm also going to explain a bit. Keep in mind that those are things which are usually handled by like specific shader programmers or tech artists in the company you might work at. So it's not completely important that you understand all of those parts, especially at the start, but just kind of try to keep in mind that there is something like this, right? So you will most likely encounter moments where you want to use something like this, and just knowing that this exists and just having a slight clue where you can find it again or what it is called can always be super nice to then explain to other people what you need. So what we're going to do here is we're going to create a so-called camera fade. So we want to be able to fade the pixel which we're currently looking at based on how far the camera is away from it. So if we get too close to the object, we want it to fade out. And this we kind of can do in a similar fashion to like how the depth fade functions, but there's not really something nicely in the engine which just does it by default. So what we're going to do is we're going to get the pixel left, which is the current distance from the pixel to the camera, and we're going to subtract a value, and this is the fade offset. So this is the offset where we want the entire thing to be completely visible. Let's say 30, quite far. And then we're gonna divide it. And this is gonna be the fade distance. Like I said, don't really worry if this doesn't really make a lot of sense. It's definitely too early in your career. And if you do, nice on you, really good. But yeah, so go in here, take the clamp, and then we gonna actually let us visualize it first. So let me showcase what this is doing in here. So deactivate it again, and then we go in here. So we have this, and it's black, and we go back, and it slowly turns white. You can see it, right? So we're gonna try to use the same functionality in here, but on the opacity. So let's get rid of the base color, and it's not visible at all. And if I go back, it slowly turns black, so it gets visible. And now it's just like a matter of like adjusting those. So we can now use actual sprites and everything in the scene. And if we just get too close, it just fades out, so we can just walk through them so they won't clutter the entire screen, which is also a very important part. It's not just about the resolution. It's also that like at some point, like if you're getting really close, you might just not see anything anymore, which you obviously don't want to. So we have those values now, and those are another multiplication on the texture or like opacity itself, right? So because we want this thing to fade out whatever we get in here. So put those things in here, and then I'm gonna go back to the opacity and put it to 1. This is what we gonna use. The entire functionality right now is that we can control the color and the opacity in a particle system. We can kind of boost it in here just to make it a bit easier for us to see, not necessarily for the particle system in the end. Then we have the depth fade, so it won't clip through walls. And then we have the camera, so it doesn't clip through the camera, basically. And you just have a bit of an easier time to hide low resolution textures. And then we obviously use the texture, which is the main driving factor for the look of everything. So we now created the main material, and we're going to use the same thing for our second sprite, and that is the single modes texture. So we're going to go in here, and Unreal has this very nice feature where you can click on a material, right mouse button, create material instance, and then it's going to create a material instance out of it. And we're going to call it MI for material instance, modes, and we're going to either call it 02 or you're going to call it just single 02, depending on 01, depending on what you like more. So this is now what we're going to get here. You won't really be able to see something. That's because of the opacity. Let's put it to 500. Now you can see it. And from here, we don't really want to change a lot of things. The main thing which we're going to change is not really any of those, honestly. We can just change the texture, because the only thing which is different on this one, which is the single things flying around, is that we're going to use the single texture. And that's what we get now. Let's put that back to 1, because this is only to help us find it in the scene. And now we have already all the textures and the materials made for the first version of the dust modes. And from here on, we're going to jump basically directly into the particle system. So see you there. So now we're going to do the actual particle system. And first of all, we're going to create another folder, because we want to have this one nice. And right mouse button, Niagara system. And new system from selected emitters is usually what you can go for. We actually going to start with an empty system. So let's use that. So we're going to call it ns_motes01. And if we open this up, go. This is what we're going to have. This is the interface. I hope some of you have seen it already. But as a very quick breakdown, this is the timeline. We can kind of scrub through to see effects. This is the viewport where the particle system is going to be rendered. And this here is like our node-based particle system. And there's a couple more things here like parameters and stuff, but you don't really need to worry about that at all so far. So if you're in here, right mouse button to move around, and if you press right mouse button in here and say add emitter, we're gonna start and take in, let's go with a simple sprite burst. So this is usually what you're gonna start with if you want to build something from basically completely scratch. So when we think about like mode system, there's a couple of things which you want to have. And first of all, let's actually take this thing. So you can press this little folder and then just kind of drag and drop here into the scene, because we actually want to see it in the scene. And one last thing, those kind of dust modes are mostly visible here under like light influence. So place it somewhere here, but up to you. And yeah, if we now go in here, you will see it repeating in here, but not in here. And that is because right now it is set to only spawn once and one particle. And this one here is going to loop, but not the actual one in the scene. So if you go into the preview, you move it around, so like with left mouse button, and then you just hover over it and press middle mouse button, then it's going to spawn. See? So space, 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 and then I spawn a couple of those. Yeah, so we're going to start with this, but we don't want this behavior. What we want is we want something which actually spawns continuously. So we have the spawn burst instantaneous in here, and we're going to change it from instantaneous to spawn rate, which is here. And we're going to change it to 2. So it's going to spawn 2 now continuously, and do this, bip, bip. But it still dies. It never comes back. So the reason for that is that in the emitter state, this is where it actually sets up how it should loop it. And this is here the loop behavior. And currently it's set up to once, so it does this thing and all of that once, and then just dies forever. We're going to change it to infinite. If we change it now, save it. Now it's going to spawn 2 each second, and you can see it because they kind of, just kind of start spawning. And yeah, from there on, we will start building the particle system. When it comes to stuff like this, the most important thing to get right is usually scaling and placement. But it can be quite nice, especially for our use case, to actually get the material first in. Because we want to build something which is quite fine detail. And if we go to Sprite Renderer, this is where we set up everything which is visual. The other things are just like the behavior. And this is the actual visual component to it, which is rendered in the end, so the material. So we just did those materials. So we go into our materials folder, and let's use the empty motes 01 for it. So, and there you can see our little splashes, our little motes. And the first thing you're obviously going to notice is, well, they're quite small. So let's go into the initialized particle module. And that is one of the most important modules about, well, they're more important than any other module, honestly. Because in here you set up the lifetime, the initial color, and the scale. And we have currently like a sprite size mode, which is set to uniform 50. That's not that big. Let's put it to 300. That is big. So if we have this, then you kind of want to be able to just say, okay, I want this to be random. Like, I don't want to have the same size all the time. So change it from uniform to random uniform, for example. And then we can go for, okay, let's say 170 to 250. Just use some values which you think look interesting. And now you can see stuff spawning in with different sizes, creating this weird parallax look to it. Kind of cool. But we don't just want to have that, but we also want to have like random lifetimes. And this is something which you can set into in the lifetime module. Right now, all of them live for 2 seconds and then they just get deleted. We can change it to random, and then we can set a value in which is a bit more reasonable. So 6 seconds. Test modes usually live for quite some time. And then the next thing would be, we want those to not just spawn in the middle, right? Because right now that looks a bit weird. And there is a couple of different modules for that, but the main module in the newer Unreal Engine versions is the shape location. And the shape location here is, by default, a sphere. And it's 100 units big, so it just spawns them in a random location inside this 1 meter big sphere. You can see that quite easily in here. We don't necessarily want a sphere for this, because we want to create something which kind of hacks onto this cone shape here. And there's not really a lot of stuff which is like perfect for it. We have the cone here, which we can use. So let's actually do that. And it comes with a couple of different things, but the most important one is actually the cone length. So let's put that to maybe 150. And we could change the cone angle as well, but overall the cone length is like the driving factor for it. So now we already have it. If you would want to use a box, that is here the box plane, that is a bit easier to understand for most people. So the box size is simply gonna kind of drag up a box here, and it's just gonna spawn it randomly in this box. This box right now is like 1 meter wide, tall, and deep. And we can change that. So if we go in here, you can see those different axes, right? So we want to have something which is a bit wider, but also a lot taller. So the Z component right now is going to be the main point. So let's put that to 200. So now you can see all of those spawning quite nicely in. And then let's change the width a bit. So maybe 140. Could be fitting. You want it to kind of spawn inside this God ray radius. You managed to pull that off. That's perfect. So right now they just kind of pop in and out, right? So one of the most important things in a particle system is actually scaling stuff in. And we already have a scale color module in here. But right now it does come with this kind of weird default curve, which just starts it at 1 and then fades out to 0, which is not too bad for the fading out part, but we obviously want to fade it in as well. So if you go in here, close it up, you just click somewhere and press enter, or you can double click on the part of the, right mouse button. And no, it was okay. Just use enter. Not quite sure what's up with this one right now. And you click on the single keyframes, like any other keyframe driven program. Just click onto it. This is the value. This is the time point. Those are normalized. So this is always the entire lifetime. So even though this shows here 1, this is, for example, if the particle system exists for 6 seconds, this is going to be the 6-second mark. So grab the first pin, move it to 0, so here, 0. And then we will try to kind of fade it in nicely. So this thing, you can move a bit back. And if you select those and press right mouse button and auto, it will kind of curve it in and out. So back to linear. So it stays at 1. Here we kind of fade it in. Yeah, so if we have this is already a good start. A good tip if you want to adjust those things a bit more in detail. So let's say this one we want to fade in just pretty smooth at the start and then slowly kind of ramp up. So if we put that straight up to auto, it's going to create this weird curve. So that's not really what we want. So let's put it to break. And now we can take the, now we have the individual tangents, which we can kind of control. And this is a bit weird to do in here. So a really good way of like having a bit of a nicer time adjusting curves is going here and show this curve in the curve overview. And this is going to open it up in here, which is a way bigger graph, way easier to adjust. And you can also type different things in here. So do this, straighten it up, also use a break maybe on this, but it looks kind of fine. And then we can use this tangent and just kind of move it down, right? So, and you can now see here how this kind of behaves. So if we have this now, let's take a look at how this actually works out in the engine. In the engine, it now slowly fades in and slowly fades out. Pretty decent already. But there's obviously more things which we can do. And one thing which can look nice on stuff like this is to also scale it up over a lifetime. So we want to start those at like the full size already, right? So, but then afterwards, let's make it scale up a tiny bit, which creates a very subtle but nice little parallax effect. This, and just adds a tiny bit more motion to it, because that's what we kind of want. We want stuff to kind of move forward, or at least make it look like it's moving forward. And from here on, there is the actual movement, which we want to have for all of that. So let's go in here and add a so-called curl noise force. What this is doing is, I'm going to explain it a bit more in detail in the next module, but it basically gives you a random direction where stuff is moving towards you. See that? Just move somewhere. And with all of that, for those kind of particles, keep it very, very simple. You really don't want to have like a lot of motion in those because that can get super noisy. So keeping it on like 330, you see them really, really subtly move, but it's really not that much. You can also activate here pen noise field that will make sure that it gets like random values kind of all of the time because it scrolls through a 3D grid. And yeah, then one thing which you want to use is a so-called drag, which is basically adjusting the velocity it's receiving over a period of time. Imagine it like a brake on a car. The longer you push it down, the slower you get. That's kind of what it's doing automatically. We have the drag here, and we're going to randomize that because we don't want the same values all over the place. So let's put it to 0.5 and also 0.8. And then the curl noise force will move it at the start a bit more. And then it slowly starts slowing down. But at that time, it already kind of scales up. So there's still some motion in there, but it's a bit of a different motion. So it's a bit more wispy looking. And one quite big factor, which we should also look into, is now actually getting the color values right and making it look a bit more interesting. Because now we have the scaling right, we have like the fading in and out, all of that looks good. But we still scale them like kind of uniformly, and also the entire thing looks way too strong. This is not really how that would look like. So one big point is also the sprite rotation mode, which is currently set to unset. Therefore, it just spawns it always perfectly aligned upwards. So if we go into here again, you can see them just like spawning perfectly in the square form. So all the time, if we change that to random, you will see them spawning randomly rotated. Therefore, you can get a completely different result just because you rotate the image, which is spawning. And then another really big point, we won't really animate any of the color values in here because it doesn't really make a lot of sense. But what we want to do is we go into the color module. You can just click onto it. And first of all, you could adjust the colors in here. So now it's pink, if you want that. Not quite sure why you would, but you can. You can change it to something slightly bluish if you want to. But the main value we want to adjust here is the alpha. And we're going to put that to, let's say, 0.1. So it can be quite subtle. Maybe 0.15 actually looks decent. Yeah. So with stuff like this, you always want to make sure that it's really subtle. It should add something, but not too much over a long period of time, because it just gets kind of noisy. So even this is already kind of stretching it, but it looks fine. And then also another thing which we can do to make it look a bit more interesting, we change the spawn rate from 2 to 2 to 3. So sometimes it spawns one more. And then also the shape location can be a bit taller even, right? So just to kind of make them spawn in and out a bit more interestingly. Now we have this very subtle stuff going on here. So jump in here. So you can see some of those dots here, which look pretty decent. And now we want to go to the, second emitter. And those would be like the individual little things flying around. And what we can do is, first of all, rename this. This is going to be the mode splatter. And then you can literally copy and paste this module. And we're just going to rename it to Singer. And in here, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to exchange the sprite renderer in here to the modes Singer. Therefore, we spawn the big splashes. Yeah, so we can keep most of the stuff as it is. But you can already see that looks pretty weird. So the main portion we're gonna change is the spawn rate, which we can, well, push up quite a lot, at least for now, just to kind of showcase something nicely. But change the initial size to something super small. So let's say 325 or 326. Let's say 326. And we can keep the box plane size similar, but we can also kind of just make it a bit bigger so that it's overshooting a bit, like individual sprites kind of spawning somewhere around here. So this would be like the starting point, and there's obviously a couple more things we can adjust for those, because they don't or shouldn't be visible for that long. So we can kind of push those together. Let's say 0.5. We delete this one here, which is kind of faded in and out. It's already put to break, so did I select 2? Okay, yeah. So this kind of faded in just very quickly, and then in the middle it's actually completely visible, and then it fades out again. So those can be a tiny bit more visible, so let's put it to 3.5. And there's not a lot more stuff which we will need for those. We can actually go with a bit more noise strength on those, so they should be able to move a bit more, because if you think about it, there's always going to be a bit of movement on individual sprites, because like they just are really light. It just gives an interesting look to all of them. So we have it like this, then you just kind of keep it. But those should also probably fade in and out. So we can also go in here and just click on those presets. By the way, they're kind of useful sometimes. We create a second one. Say this is, I don't know, 0.8. And then we just kind of move it towards it. Press 1 on those to automatically fade them in. And then they will spawn in and out. So if we take a look at this, we have a couple of moving things. So they move a bit too strong, and they're also just like overall a bit too big. But they're going into the right direction. So if we go in here and we say, yeah, let's just kind of jump in here, make them smaller. Could already do the trick. Let's see. So, yeah, there's a couple of them which just kind of move a lot more. Yeah. That's a bit too fast. So go in here, change it to maybe 2. Noise frequency on 10 gives it already an interesting movement. We don't need a lot more. And then obviously kind of turn the spawn rate down. So also a good thing for those here, you can change it from being a GPU simulation to a GPU sim, which is just for those very small particle systems, which spawn a lot better. So go in here, change it to compute sim, and then another thing which you will need to do, you go into here the calculate bounds, and you change that to fixed, and that's basically already gonna adjust it for you. So yeah, we have all of that set up here. Then you have a first version of it, which then just kind of comes down a lot to like how you would like yours to look. I would always kind of suggest when it comes to stuff like this, keep it subtle. they should really not be too strong in your scene. So always play a lot around with those alpha values, and just overall the movement, keep them visible because you're still paying performance for them being there. So if you don't see them, not that great. But always kind of keep in mind that those things are not supposed to move a lot or like really catch your attention. They're just there to kind of fill in the image and look nice and support some of the other elements, which those here do kind of decently. But always kind of keep it subtle. Try to make sure that you just have the right feel for them when you kind of imagine those in real life. Yeah, and this is actually the main lecture for the modes. There's going to be an additional module after this, which is going to be a bit more advanced, which is how I would approach this entire topic when it comes to an actual production standpoint. Because using it like this here is valid, but there's a couple of things concerning like usability as well as performance, which is simply quite hard to handle when you use it like this. So we're going to have a secondary lecture for everybody who's interested in going the extra step to build something which is completely usable in basically any game setting even. So yeah, see you there. And welcome back, but this time for the advanced lecture. So there's a couple of little things I quickly want to talk about, and which are basically the reason for the advanced lecture. So if we go in here and we can see our particle system, everything looks kind of decent. But the main thing about any of this is that the overdraw is just not great. So if you kind of already played a bit around with VFX and just graphics in general, you should know that like as soon as there's multiple transparent things on top of each other, it usually gets expensive. And Unreal you can go into like the view modes, optimization modes, and then shader complexity. And this is going to give you like a decent understanding of where you are. Honestly, those values are not perfect. And I don't want you to always look at them in terms of like, oh, it's white, I can't use that. Those values are calculated in a bit of a weird way. Like if you really want to know the actual cost of a particle system, you need to profile it quite in detail with some people who actually know what they're talking about for most part. And this here is still a really good example case where even though this wouldn't be insanely bad, this is something which you can optimize quite nicely and create something out of it which is way easier to adapt, as well as just quite light on performance compared to this version. Because right now we just kind of spawn randomly a bunch of sprites, which are just, well, spawned randomly. So we never really quite know where there's going to be more overlap. So let me kind of show you and talk you through the process of how I would approach that. For this one, we do have kind of a cone shape. So if we spawn stuff randomly, there's going to be like random spots of expensive overdraw. But what if we change the entire thing from being random to something which is more deterministic, which for this one is going to be a particle system with a mesh. So we have something which still gives random movement and kind of blends it together, but we're going to get a mesh to kind of just place here, basically a cone, which then kind of nicely hugs onto this shape and only has like one layer of transparency. And we just spawn way less sprites around it to kind of blend it in a bit nicer. And this is what we're going to do. So we're going to jump into Blender. In the next lecture, I'm going to go into a bit more detail again, how to use it. But for now, just middle mouse button, you can look around, Shift and middle mouse button, you can pan around. And Shift A, and you're going to be able to open up this menu which you can go to mesh, and then we're going to use a cylinder. This cylinder we can basically almost keep like it is. So we go here to add cylinder and change it from n-gon to nothing. This is going to get rid of the upper and lower cap. And then if we kind of press tab or go here into edit mode, we have already everything selected, and we press G and then Z and then Y. And this did not select everything. Let me try that a second time. So press A this time. Everything should be selected. So if you click onto one thing and then press A, it's going to select everything. And then let's do the same again. G, Z for the axes, and then 1. And now we moved it up exactly 1 unit. So perfectly placed in here. So this will make sure that the pivot point is at the bottom. So we can just place it somewhere on the ground and it's going to look exactly like this. Now, what we want to do is we go into, well, you press 1 to be in vertice mode, and you select the upper vertices here. And then you can just press S, and then just kind of move it into the middle. And we want to have kind of a cone shape. Doesn't need to be completely closed, but something like this can look good. But this is also stuff which you need to kind of play around in the end. So if you press tab, then we're going to have this as a result. And the last thing you need to do is right mouse button and shade smooth. And now you're going to have something which looks like this. Not perfect, because the amount of words is not great for it, but good enough for our use case at least. So we can go here into a corner, just kind of drag it up. And what we're going to do is we change it up here from 3D viewport to UV editor. And now we're going to see the UVs of the mesh. So if you click onto it and then press edit, so you need to be in edit mode, you're going to see all the words. And if you press A to actually show all of them, you, well, going to see the result in here. Go up here to the double arrows. And then if you select those, you can see which words you select in here, also in the final viewport. Right now, the lower edge is also the lower edge in here, the upper edge in here. So that works fine. And this is basically already perfect for our use case. So let's use this in an actual setting. So we're going to click on this, go to File, Export, FBX Export, and we're going to go into a folder called Environment Course Meshes, and we're going to call it fx_mesh motes cylinder. Let's go for that. Select meshes or objects only, no bake animation, and then export it. Back in the engine, we will kind of see what we can do. So in the modes folder, let's create another folder, which is called meshes. And everything in here we will already have. So the course meshes, and then let's drag in the meshes modes and cylinder FBX. We do not want to create a new material. This is the only thing in the material setting which you want to change. So it's going to open up like this here. And yeah, only thing you need to adjust is change it from create new materials to do not create materials and say import. You can kind of ignore this. And now you have something which you can actually put into the scene. And let's put it at the location we want it to be and scale it like this. So this is slowly getting somewhere. Let's use it like this. Okay. So first of all, we don't want this thing to cast any shadows. So let's go to cast shadows in here and just deactivate it. And what we have now is basically the silhouette where we're going to use a shader on, which will kind of fake the particles look. So kind of what we do is, if we would now just like kind of apply this material, that's what we have right now. It already has a soft intersection, so it won't fade out. And if we get closer, it fades out. Kind of decent, right? Well, there's a couple of issues with those. First of all, this does look a bit weird and stretched, and there's not that great of a detail in there, as well as you see the edges and all those kind of things we want to get rid of. So what do? We take the motes material and we duplicate it, and we're going to call it mesh. And so from here on, we will kind of rebuild it. This is what we did before, and we will just need to build a couple more things onto it to kind of make it look interesting or like final. The first one is going to be a Fresnel, and what this does is let me showcase you. It's usually easier. So we can, by the way, if you create nodes, you can say right mouse button, start previewing node, and you will see what this node or all the nodes feeding into this will result in. So this is the start, and we want to have something like, let's say this, but we want to invert it. And what this first of all does, let me showcase what we get. This is what we get. It kind of, everything which points towards the camera, like the normals of the individual verts, for example, or this one, the, well, fragment normals. You don't really need to worry about it too much. But when they create a dot product which is trying to figure out, does this point look towards the camera or not? It doesn't right now, so it gets black. And this is why we, with 1x inverted, because this would be, does it look towards the camera, then make it black. And then we invert it because we want to be able to have this here to fade it out on the edges. So if we then use a power node, we basically make the black parts darker and the white ones kind of stable, but that depends on the value. So if we do this on 4, this is what we're getting. So the edge is from each side completely faded out, even here on the cylinder, and that's what we're using. So this is going to be the main part here. So we're going to multiply this and preview it. Now we're going to use that on our mesh, and suddenly we get rid of the edges, which is quite nice. And from here on, we will kind of play around with like a couple more things, but overall they're a bit more subtle compared to this change. The first one is still slightly bigger one, and first one, we want to change the modes splatter to splatter tile, because we want to use the tileable texture on it, which we created. Because now we will actually multiply our UVs, and that creates the tiling. So what we can go in here, we can say tile X, and then tile Y, and what this. Okay, now, for whatever reason, now we have something which we can use together to say, how often do you want this thing to tile? So plug that in here, plug it in here. Let me quickly showcase it to you nicer. In here, sprite. So this is the default texture, and that is now just like laid out perfectly. If we now tile this 2 times 2, you can see it is nicely tiled. We can also tile that 1 times 2, so like it gets repeated twice on X, but only once on Y. And this we can kind of play around with afterwards. Also, one little thing which we want to add for this kind of stuff, we have animated the sprites. So if this would be just static and standing in here, that would feel a bit weird. So we can use a panel node, and what this is doing, it moves the UVs and therefore moves the entire thing. So if I plug that in here and I say x.3, you should be able to see, you need to go in here to 3 dots and say real time. Then you will see that this entire thing kind of moves to the left side. And the smearing right now, that is because of our anti-aliasing. Don't worry too much about that. And let's get some really small values in there, honestly. Can be quite subtle. Something like that. Really can move just a tiny bit. We don't need a lot. Yeah, and from here on, we have most of the important stuff covered. If we now apply this, we have modes which are moving, and we have a couple more things. And one thing which can be nice is we can change it to be two-sided. So now we see not only the front, but also the back. This gives us like a decent parallax effect. And we can adjust our tiling. So let's say 2 times 2 to kind of match the detail layer and the size we have with the actual sprites. So this already gives a nice volumetric feel to it. There's a few more little things which we can do, but the only one I'm going to talk about right now is to kind of fade it out at the top, right? So we have this, and it just kind of goes on here, and you can kind of see the edge a bit. Not too bad, but we can get rid of that super easily. So I just kind of want to showcase you how to do it. If we have the UVs and we use a component mask, so we only want to use like one of those channels. Let me quickly showcase you how this is how a texture set looks like. It starts with 0, 0, and then goes to 1 and to 1, X and Y. So green and red. And if we use the component mask and we showcase that one, we're going to have like black at the top, white at the bottom. And if we now multiply this times 2, and then also let's use a saturate. And what a saturate does, it just kind of cuts off all the values which are above 1. Let's showcase that. This is what we're getting. So it's pretty much white all the way, and then from kind of the middle on, it slowly starts fading out and the top is completely black. So if we use this as a multiplication on what we had before, we will fade out everything which is on the top. And therefore it will be like a way softer gradient towards the actual top. See that? Can't really make out any more where it starts. So this is a pretty good way of like getting something in, which is usually quite expensive. But now when we go in here, we can see there's a bit of stuff wrong with it. So first of all, the tiling could be a tiny bit bigger. By the way, go with like full values on those here. So something like this, 3, 3, that looks good. Then the movement, I think that's decent. That's fine. But then there's obviously like different things you could still adjust. But at this point, what you try to do is you will try to use your particle system to kind of blend this shape in. And if we go now to optimization view modes, shader complexity, we have our mesh and we do have our modes. So if we deactivate the modes, we have just the one mesh, which is really not too bad. Like it looks red. Like I said, don't give too much on that estimation because honestly, it's calculated in an interesting way. So if we go to our modes and we activate them, we see this. So we don't need that much stuff anymore. So what we can do is we go in here and we have the mode splatter. And first of all, let's turn down like the spawn rate to like 1.2 and let's say 2. First of all, this is a decent start. And then also we want to kind of adjust where we spawn those. So right now it spawns somewhere in the middle, and we want to make this thing like bigger to actually spawn less in the middle, but like more on the edges almost of this thing. So first of all, there's less overdraw, and also it kind of blends those things out. So we can actually go with like 300, I would say. Let's do that. Yeah. Now we kind of draw stuff around the shape, and now we already have like way less overdraw. Now we could go in here as well and like adjust the mode single thing as well, and just create something which blends everything in a bit more nicely. And always kind of make sure that when you do stuff like this, that you go back into a viewport and actually see what the end result looks like, because the less stuff you spawn, usually you want to kind of dial up your opacity to kind of balance this out. So if we go 0.5 and all this kind of stuff, then we should have something which looks quite decent already. So we spawn stuff here. Maybe that's a bit too much. So 0.5, 0.4, and here 0.23. So this quite simple thing already made the entire effect a lot more easy to use, because at this point we have the, if we go in here, we have the motes, and we do have the mode cylinder, and we could kind of just parent those onto each other, and now we can take the entire thing, just kind of move it around, right? So we have this thing, and like environment artists could just like place it anywhere, and they can also like rescale certain things, and they can just have a lot of control over how they want this thing to look like. And now they can literally like mask out their god rays, which can be, especially for lighting artists, be a really nice thing, which they like. So we have this thing, which is quite cheap, and then we just spawn a couple more particle system sprites around it, which then create a look of something kind of breaking out, right? So this here. By the way, don't scale those; they should stay the same. Looks interesting. No, unparent them right now because we would need to do a couple more small adjustments for that to work nicely. But yeah, we have this, and this here now gives you quite nice volumetric feel and look to stuff. And you get closer, it still fades out perfectly, but you feel like you're going through something. And at this point, yeah, it's literally just adjusting a couple more things till it really looks nice and fitting to the scene. Right now, maybe a bit too strong, maybe adjusting the tiling a tiny bit more, or also literally giving the cylinder here just a couple more subdivisions, right? So if you do a new one, cylinder, don't go with 30, go with maybe 50, something like that. And then shade smooth. This looks a bit smoother. Don't overdo it, but overall, this effect is going to be a lot cheaper now compared to what we had before. We simulate less stuff and we're going to have less overdraw. So yeah, this is what we gonna end the lecture with. And from here on, we're gonna go into the next couple of little things which we can hopefully build upon afterwards. See you in the next material.